I'm actually not that old. Like, I wasn't there for the first wave of VR, but yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, my name is Paolo. I'm from Italy. I've been living in the US for a bunch of years. I've been making political, satirical, experimental games for 15 years almost. But I'm not going to talk about that. I have a quick VR piece that you can try downstairs. It's called A Short History of the Gaze, and it is an experiential essay about the relationship between gaze and violence and the implication of looking at things. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about making VR countercultural again. Or you kids, you should make that. Okay, let's start from Jesus. So last year they announced this project called Jesus VR, and for a second I was excited. Like finally something interesting is happening in VR. What is Jesus VR? Is it going to be a first-person Passion of Christ simulator? Am I going to be crucified and resurrect? That kind of stuff. Am I going to have a Trinity avatar? No, it turns out it was just a 360 movie. And you follow the story of Jesus, from the perspective of a bystander in Palestine, and just I guess you look around. But the thing is, like, if you have Jesus in front of you, why would you want to look at other things? Like at the extras, at the pottery in Nazareth, at the movie set, To me, Jesus VR is like VR porn. What is the purpose of expanding the frame? It's like, oh, nice table, like coffee table. Is it? Oh, like that's a cool loft, right? Yeah, maybe orgies. And as we know, we know why this is happening. Like the VR term is used as a novelty, as a marketing gimmick. Way back, the Virtual Boy was, the VR wave was used as a marketing kind of like way to signal innovation, novelty, and so on. Because we call VR a bunch of different things that rely on a similar hardware. But I don't want to try to normatively identify what's real virtual reality and what's fake virtual reality. To me, the interesting thing is that the variety and the openness of the concept is due to the fact that VR is the convergence of different traditions. Traditions that have different aesthetics, different goals, and different strategies. And I want to highlight the problems of the most popular ones and try to maybe recuperate traditions and strategies that became less popular for some reason. Not the Nintendo Virtual Boy, although it's pretty cool, I tried it. So for example, like the 360 video tendency is essentially an augmentation of cinema. Do you like cinema? What about more cinema? More immersion, more emotional engagement, but it also predates cinema. Like, it comes from the kind of theater conceived by Wagner, with completely dark surround reverb system, bigger immersive stages, and it was a technology that complemented the idea of total work of art that in German is... Yeah, okay. Kind of like this idea of overwhelming the viewer on many levels. And it comes from the panoramas and dioramas of the early 19th century, like this very controlled experience, controlled lights. And what they were essentially like 360 paintings of landscapes or battle scenes. And the first 360 film experience was the Cineorama. It was like at the Paris Expo in 1900. And it was essentially a simulated ride on a hot air balloon over Paris. And it was like as heavy as the current technology. It was like 10 synchronized projectors, shooting movies, actually, films. That film was still very young at that point. And it lasted 3 days and then got shut down because it was overheating and people were fainting and they were afraid of fires. So like this idea of VR, it was like this heavy technology that makes you sick. It was like even before digital. And then proper 360 cinema was for the first time successfully deployed in theme parks, and it always had been to me an amusement park novelty, and it still kind of is. One of the recognized precursors of a proper VR was this obscure device called Sensorama that was meant to expand cinema with stereoscopic vision, wide frame, and even like providing scripted smell and haptic. And that too seems like a gimmick, like a novelty for an amusement park. But it was actually, like the guy was actually pretty serious. Like he saw it as a way to apply the scientific method to art making. And he wrote an essay in which he's basically arguing that more sensory overwhelming produces more powerful experiences and therefore produces more powerful art. And that narrative is still around, and it's one of the biggest selling points of VR for the non-tech people, you know, like the normies. I'm talking about the idea of VR as an empathy machine, the notion that there is a lack of empathy in the world and VR can fix it. And VR usually meant a 360 video again. And it started by this TED talk by Chris Milk. You know, like the argument is, if only we can show powerful people, politicians and millionaires, the suffering in an immersive way, they will do something about it. And that idea got picked up, and there is a whole genre of 360 refugee videos and empathy experiences. And many people, including myself, have been critical about this approach. I think it's reductionist and maybe even insulting to think that a technology that is really just a visual illusion can foster a better understanding of the other. It calls into question the issue of voyeurism, who's looking at who, poverty tourism, the disaster tourism, and because it becomes a medium for presence and not just storytelling. The idea is that you are there, but you're nobody, you're a disembodied gaze. And since these technologies are not really cheap, this kind of documentaries are rarely made by the subject that are part of the investigation. So another tendency of VR is doing everything here is like an extension of essentially simulation technologies. And that tradition goes back to military simulation and cybernetics as well, providing essentially a virtual environment to try things out, like learning to operate a plane without risking to crash the vehicle. And Ivan Sutherland, who is the father of virtual reality and augmented reality, was working for the military with head-mounted displays, right, attached to a live video feed. And he realized essentially the potential of having computer-generated imagery instead of videos attached to that head-mounted display. And it was a pretty easy leap to do because he also invented computer graphics. And he also went as far as envisioning this ultimate display that it's a kind of like a room scale VR able to simulate matter, like the holodeck in Star Trek, or the world of Alice in Wonderland, like kind of like magical world in which everything is possible and matter is relative and so on. And the kind of imagination wasn't really what the military cared about, wasn't what we was looking for, and so VR ended up initially simulating only essentially reality. And I think there's nothing wrong with simulating reality. Like VR simulations have many specialized applications from not only military but also architecture, surgery, space exploration, treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on. The problem maybe is when this tendency is generalized to inform VR as a mass consumer commodity, and you end up with this reductionist or even dystopian ideas. I don't know if you can read, but this is basically the Oculus Rift guy that is saying, like, if you can perfect virtual reality, there's nothing else to perfect. You basically solve all of your problems. You just have to stick people in a box, Matrix style, and then you make them imagine whatever they need, right? So another related tendency, I think, is VR as an extension of communication systems, like an augmentation of telephone or an augmentation of Skype, the telegraph, and so on. And that's referred as telepresence, usually. And the first application of VR technology in that sense, as we know it, it was like that. It was like, this headset and the hand interface manipulator. It was like that. It was NASA. Oh, the video's not working, but whatever. So back in the late 80s, NASA was looking for ways to operate robots at distance. And, oh, here's the video, yeah. And today, I think there are massive investments, in this approach, like Facebook Spaces that you've seen last week. I think these trailers are interesting, these commercials are interesting because they are not just commercials, but they are also ways to understand the desires, the obscure desire of informational capitalism. It makes basically sense that Facebook wants this because Facebook works by imposing itself as a parasitical medium for existing social relationships. Like it establishes basically in your social network and dictates the protocols and in exchange for this service mines your data and pushes advertising and so on. And so it's not surprising it's trying to colonize other kinds of relationships like the real-time face-to-face encounters via telepresence. And my impression is that maybe that kind of stuff might not going to work this way because from the user perspective, Facebook is not a medium quite, but more of a relationship management system. It doesn't expand your relational capabilities as much as it optimizes them. And like it makes it easier to keep track of life events, names, emotional states of a enlarging, expanding, sprawling social network because of our interconnected and mobile society. You used to really call people or send people emails for their birthdays, right? Facebook kind of automates that or semi-automate that. And Facebook works because it runs in the background of your life. There is always like a baby picture on the other tab and that kind of stuff. And part of that efficiency is that Facebook is asynchronous, so it can fit in your life however you want, whenever you have the time. And Facebook Spaces, of course, allows you to meet new people far away, but it's not really integrated with our usage of computing machines until we all start working in VR and reading news in VR and procrastinating in VR, which I don't think is going to happen soon. But so to me, like what's even more unconvincing in sort of the ordinary norm core aspects of this interaction, like let's take a selfie, check out my apartment, because the other part of Facebook business model is to be an entity that verifies identity, an identity verifying service. Only states, only nation and credit card companies can do that. And that's what Facebook wants to be. Twitter doesn't care about your identity. You can be anything on Twitter. Facebook does. And that's why they are obsessed with real names and real information. And that's why they want Facebook Spaces to be a space when you can be yourself in virtual reality, as they say, but you can only be yourself. And to me, if you really want to convince people to put some heavy gear on their faces and commit to real-time interactions, you have to be less ordinary. I think you have to throw extraordinary gatherings like VR role-playing games or like a VR version of Burning Man in which everybody can participate as creator, in which anything can be everybody. I think VR spaces, like in the Facebook sense, should maybe happen once a year and be like Burning Man for people who don't have money or Burning Man for ugly people. Right? And this is where I leap from simulation to simulacrum in the Baudrillard and Deleuze sense here illustrated in a questionable way. But yeah, so like essentially two images, experiences that have no resemblance with reality, experiences that become truth in their own right. And for example, this takes me to a less popular tendency of VR, which is an augmentation of dreams or being other elsewhere, the creation of other states of consciousness. I think that's one of the traditions to reclaim, is the tradition of creating stranger realities. And this tendency too, if you want, you can link it to pre-digital tendencies as well. So like think about the architecture of churches, especially in the Baroque period, which used these illusioning techniques to blend the 2D images with architecture, but also provide a truly immersive experience, including the play of light, smell, and surround sound with organ and reverberation, with essentially the purpose of overwhelming and creating the sublime through scale and intensity. It's kind of like religion as a psychedelic drug. Or think about the expressive architecture of theme parks or monuments sort of like the disorienting structure. I still have to go back to that, but I remember like the Garden of Exile in the back of the Jewish Museum here in Berlin. It is this kind of like tilted architecture, and to me is much more effective than the Holocaust parkour museum in the city center, in the memorial in the city center, or installation art messing with your perception, like James Turrell or Yokoi Kusama, Infinity Rooms made of mirrors. The history of VR in the early 90s is directly related to subculture and psychedelia. Like the best example of this convergence is this Mondo 2000 magazine. It was a magazine or a fanzine, which was, think about it as a more anarchist precursor of Wired, essentially. And the topics were drugs, cyberpunk, technology, underground music, esoteric, really weird esoteric stuff that you don't want to hear about anymore. And you can see articles, by the CEO of Autodesk, next to Timothy Leary, was the prophet of LSD, and next to William Gibson, and that kind of stuff. And this psychedelic, subcultural, and mystical element was very clearly an influence for Jaron Lanier, who was the central figure of the first wave of VR in the early 90s. This is just a quote from an early interview. Like there is this theme of disrupting the sense of reality. If you can be anything, if you can, in a sense, your sense of self will break down, your consciousness becomes a flow going through all things, like David O'Reilly's game, but more visceral. And the first experiments with avatars in the VR, like from Jaron Lanier's studio, involve inhabiting things like a lobster's body, like other non-human perspectives. Or even like VR as a tool for post-symbolic language, which is a somewhat interesting concept. If you can improvise reality, you don't need to communicate realities using symbols or language and so on. And Jaron Lanier himself was like a musician and was an artist. So the first applications of VR were artistic, not just like tech demo as you see now, like with Oculus. Like this is a documentation of a performance. There was something like a hand in the world and this disembodied floating hand, and then just pushing abstract things and making sound with that, because he's a poly-instrumentalist person. And he wasn't alone. Like the artists went into VR right on, also thanks to the support of the institutions like the Banff Center for the Arts in Alberta, in Canada. And like this one, for example, was a computer-based visualization of the body of the artist, which was the artist manipulated and animated to represent decay and healing. And this idea was like really in stark contrast with the idea of disembodiment associated to VR. Like VR is this idea that you're kind of like a mind floating around. In this case, yes, you're a mind floating around, but it kind of like puts it back into the body in a kind of like graphic way even. Or Placeholder, that was this extremely complex setup for two players. Like as soon as they had VR, they started making it social again. And incorporated elements of local mythology, incorporated performers and oral history, and sampled actual location in the Canadian Rockies. So it was kind of like trying to do that kind of like 3D scanning of real environments and so on. Nice, like he's floating like a bird or something, yeah. Or this one, Osmos by Char Davies, was controlled by breath. Like you would kind of like float up, like sink and float based on your breath, and by body tilt. So there was no kind of like gestural controller, no like gloves. And the breathing interaction was meant to, quote, reaffirm the priority of being in the world compared with doing things in it or to it. Because much of the VR idea was like, I'm gonna poke this thing, I'm gonna, operate this thing. So that is more like really kind of incorporating, embodying in another space. And she kind of like pioneered the use of transparency in 3D spaces. She had a background in painting, and she was scuba diving, and that kind of like shows a lot in this kind of floaty and painterly experience. And you often hear that VR is this new frontier, a new medium to explore, and we have no idea of what can be possibly done in VR because we are still defining the language of VR, and we are the first ones. Like the kind of statement erases the work of these artists. There are not that many, but they existed, and they are still around, and they were mostly women. And they were, I think, doing much more challenging work than just throwing a few models and a few 3D models into Unity. So, the question is, how did we get from these adorable weirdos working in their garage to these conference rooms full of Silicon Valley bros? And of course, we know the first wave of VR didn't really work out. The technology wasn't really there. It was making people sick, and it wasn't accessible. But the fact that it wasn't accessible, most people understood it through sensational journalism and sci-fi and pop culture. And pop culture in the 90s, that's the part I remember, was dark and dystopian, and it kind of portrayed VR in a very moralistic way, and it kind of channeled this 90s anxiety about rapid changes in technologies, the fear of disconnection with reality in an increasingly mediated world, and so on. And VR was always presented as simulation that affects the real world, that mess with your brain, that was used by criminals, and they might even kill you in real life, that kind of stuff, which I think we should reclaim that moral panic too. This is good stuff. Oh, that's weird that I have two videos going on at the same time. But yeah, that's a scene from Hackers. So same year really. And let's make VR dangerous again. Let's make it obscenely gay, like Robert Young said. Let's make it queer, so that the toxic mainstream gamer culture, the normcore Facebook culture, stays away from it, so that the Silicon Valley bros and their investors get freaked out. And this takes me to the last tendency that perhaps is even more connected to altered states and more dangerous, because, when you're taking drugs or you get drunk, it's usually more like a filter to cognition and thought. You're not really completely in another world. The world is still there and kind of interacts with your state. So being in between states as opposed to fully immersed, what is usually referred as augmented reality or mixed reality. And I know what you're thinking probably, if you're thinking of augmented reality, that's usually presented as a kind of informational overlay between you and the world on the top of a live video feed, essentially. So hypothetically it works on a pair of smart glasses or a phone that you move around, or contact lenses or retinal implants like dark mirror and that kind of stuff. And really that's the ultimate dream for advertisers like Facebook, because they can finally become the ultimate interface between you and the physical world. And it's also a super sad and boring proposition. This is a bit more interesting, I think. Mixed reality to remap your bodily experience to other realities. I think it's relatively quaint. You're just flying in some stupid spaceship, but still, I kind of like the idea, and I kind of want to try it. Or even more simply, having conversation while you're immersed. Where are you exactly when you're just hanging out with people in a living room and they're sort of seeing what you're doing, but maybe sort of not, while you're elsewhere. Or even playing asymmetrically with people who are outside. And, you're laughing. Okay, people have been making fun of this picture, right? Why would you put a headset on, in such an ideal date scenario? You're in fucking Tuscany, hang out with your girlfriend and so on. No, but I'm actually curious, what's going on in there? What are they talking about? I think smell and taste and haptics are impossible to simulate, so it makes sense to not simulate them. Or think about mixed reality VR sex. It is always imagined in this kind of creepy way, or in this creepy interfaces as a complete simulation, as a complete surrogate. Or again with the idea of telepresence, sex at distance mediated by machines and teledildonics and headsets. This is a concept from a 19 magazine that was kind of like Mondo 2000 I was showing earlier about the future of sex. The magazine is called Future Sex. Or this classic scene from The Lawnmower Man, which is a bad movie, but regardless, he managed to put VR on the map. And it kind of framed this technology as a perverted, dangerous technology. Have you ever seen this? Yeah, so incredible, some of them.
Right here, Marty.
But it's also kind of cool because it shows this post-human and fluid and queer sexuality. It's not a simulation of real sex, it's just like something other, really. So this set was like mind-blowing in the 90s. I had a professor who was actually selling these early VR things, and people were, after seeing this movie, were calling him by saying, "But can you actually have sex like that movie?" And but even more interestingly, it depicts this rape in cyberspace that is kind of anticipating the issue of boundary, negotiation, and consent in social VR.
Nothing can hurt us in here.
Don't Harry, I went out.
You know what you really want, Marty? Watch this.
Oh my God, what are you doing? John, what are you doing?
It's funny, but also kind of serious. I mean, like, people are actually trying to solve these problems of, like, what happens when, an avatar gets too close to you and starts to harass you in virtual reality. And her brain gets fried and things like that, whatever. But so instead of this impossible simulationist, or telepresence approach, instead of creating surrogates of sex, you can imagine VR augmented sex, right? Like, take this ordinary situation and add VR gear, like, without replacing the haptics, without replacing the touch and the human intimacy, but rather remapping them on other realities. The great things. I think the great thing about VR is that it doesn't have to be objective. It doesn't have to be a consensual hallucination, like Gibson once said, defining cyberspace. Cyberspace is a consensual hallucination. No, it doesn't really have to be like that. It can be asymmetrical and subjective, right? So I want to end of an even more positive note. VR as a mass consumer gadget is probably not happening. Like, the hype is fading, the numbers are in. Sony seems to be big in Japan, maybe because of that kind of creepy sexuality that might have a market there. But Vive sold only about 400,000 units, something like that, and Oculus sold 200,000 units. And just to give you an idea, that is about the size of an Iron Maiden show in Brazil. That is the kind of cultural relevance that we have right now, right? The South American Iron Maiden fans. So consumer VR is kind of dead, but I think also that's great news, because this time the hardware works pretty well, I will say. It's like an alien spaceship that fell on Earth, and all the aliens died. And the aliens, my metaphors are the Silicon Valley motherfuckers that want you to go shopping in a VR shopping mall. And now we have to figure out how to use this technology, this strange, weird technology, and, for our very human desires. And that's all I have to say. Thank you for having me.